Good morning, HASP scholars. Welcome to spring. Remember, pull out your cell phones and put them on silent mode, please. Before we get too far into this, I want to also remind everybody that membership renewal in HASP begins tomorrow. We'll go online and take care of that. Before we get any further, I'd like to mention a person to this august body who is very important to us. And he is here. Scott Travis, where are you? Stand up, please. Scott has been a vital component in the relationship between Hope College and HASP. He has been so important to me in my duties as president. He is a valuable asset to Hope, a valuable asset to us, and now he is a valuable asset as vice president of Aquinas College. So a great career move for you, Scott. You will be missed. Sitting next to him is his replacement, Carla Boss. Please stand up, Carla, so everybody can see you. Okay, now let's do the quote, and then we get to the speaker, which is what you're here for. Because we have an extreme athlete here, a marathon swimmer, I decided to use a quote from the athletic realm. In this case, Vince Lombardi, even though he's not a swimmer. Sorry. The spirit, the will to win, and the will to excel are the things that endure. These qualities are so much more important than the events that occur. Would you agree with that? Now, having said that, let me introduce the speaker. A marathon swimmer, Bryan Huffman. He's a local ophthalmologist. He has 3 degrees from the University of Michigan in medicine. MD is one of them. He also has a residency at the University of Florida. He swam in high school, varsity swimmer, and then didn't swim for 25 years because, well, education and life kind of got in the way. But he took it up again, and now he's a marathon swimmer. This year, it is his plan to swim, or you did swim the English Channel. You crossed the English Channel. Wow. And this year, he is going to swim the 20 bridges he has completed the 20 bridges in Manhattan. 2 major swims. He attempted Lake Michigan. That didn't work out, but I'm sure you're going to try it again someday. Yeah, he's nodding. This summer, he intends to swim across Lake Erie, the Catalina Channel, and Loch Lomond in Scotland. You realize none of those places have warm water, right? None of them. Especially Scotland. You swim around the ice. Anyway, you didn't come here to hear me chat with him, you want him to talk. So please welcome Bryan Huffman, ophthalmologist and marathon swimmer.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. As you said, my name is Bryan Huffman, and a couple years ago, I got into marathon swimming, and I'm here to talk a little bit about that today. I'll talk a little bit about the English Channel, and then more kind of about the 2 swims I did this last year. And let me see if I can figure out how this works. There we go, perfect. So it's hard to talk about marathon swimming without talking about the English Channel, which is kind of the birthplace of marathon swimming. That's where the sport was born when Matthew Webb swam across in 1875. So the English Channel, as most of you probably know, is the body of water that separates Europe from England. And its narrowest point is the Straits of Dover, which is 21 miles across, and that's where channel crossings take place. Interestingly, the French do not call it the English Channel. They call it La Mancha, because they don't want to call any other waters English. So the English Channel has been a formidable barrier for centuries. It was the last successful invasion of England was in 1066, when William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, invaded England, and his descendants have been on the throne ever since, and most recently had protected England during the attempts of the Nazi invasion in World War II. And most people thought it was uncrossable without either a ship or an airship to get across. Until about 1870, when a sailor was on a ship in the English Channel and the boat sank, and he managed to cling to a bale of straw and float most of the way across the channel. And that made news in the local papers and got people talking about, could someone actually swim across this body of water? And in 1872, 2 years later, J.B. Johnson thought he'd give it a try, and to great fanfare, there were thousands of people on the shore at Dover. Steamships full of people went with him to begin his swim, and they were probably all still there when he came back an hour and 3 minutes later after his attempt. Many other people tried, and in 1875, on his second attempt, Captain Matthew Webb was able to successfully cross in 21 hours and 41 minutes. And that was the birth of the sport of marathon swimming. Captain Webb became world famous on the level of Charles Lindbergh or Neil Armstrong or Sir Edmund Hillary. His name was known all over the world for this feat, and many people tried over the next decades to get across, hundreds of people, and it would not be until 1911, until the second crossing, and 1923, until the third crossing of the channel. So to date, about 1,881 swimmers have successfully crossed the English Channel in 150 years. There have been 50 individuals that have done a double crossing of the channel. 30 of them are women. There have been 4 individuals that have done a triple crossing of the English Channel, 2 women and 2 men. And Sarah Thomas of the U.S. from Colorado is the only person to ever complete a quadruple crossing of the channel in 54 hours of continuous swimming. In 2022, I made my attempt at the channel, and I was the 131st and last swimmer of the year to cross. And that's a pretty typical number nowadays for how many people get across the channel. In comparison, Mount Everest has been summited nearly 12,000 times by 6,600 individuals in 70 years. And 600 Americans have been to the moon, 360 have swam across the English Channel. Of those who sign up to cross the channel and pay the deposit nowadays, about 20% end up being successful making it across the channel. So what makes it so difficult to get across the channel? And this applies to other open water swims that I'll talk about today. It's the same 4 items. One is the distance, the currents, temperature, and then what I'll call unpredictables or other aspects that make the swims difficult. The first is the distance. So I'll talk a little about England, just so it's a good example of it. The English Channel is about 22 miles across, and in swimming, a marathon is 6 miles. And that's because water is 800 times denser than air. So if you ever tried to run in shallow water, it's very difficult. It takes a lot more to move through water. And so there's a 4-to-1 conversion when you compare to running. And this is based on a lot of factors, but if you look at the Olympic running marathon and the Olympic swimming marathon, the winners for both finish in approximately 2 hours. The running marathon obviously being more miles. So the English Channel is at least 4 consecutive marathons to get across. And I say at least because of the second variable, and that is the current. The tides in the English Channel vary by 7 meters twice a day. And so 21 feet. This creates strong currents that run up and down the length of the channel and make it so that you cannot swim straight across the channel because of the currents. Your course will be an S-shaped current. And the slower you go, the bigger your S will be and the more curves that will be in it. And it adds considerable length to the distance. The currents are very strong at its peak along the coast of France. You run into a current known as La Barrière, and it is about 6 miles an hour. An Olympic open water swimmer swims at 3 miles an hour. So you cannot overcome the currents that are there. You ideally want to swim when the tides are at their lowest, what's called a neap tide, when the moon is perpendicular to the axis of the sun and the earth. On the spring tide, when they're in line, the tides are higher and it makes it harder to get across. So swims are typically booked every other week during the swim season to try to take advantage of these better tides. This is Folkestone Harbor at about mid-tide. You can see, I don't know if you can see there, but there's a dark line kind of towards the top of that retaining wall. That's the high tide mark. This is Folkestone Harbor at low tide. That marker I was standing in front of earlier that you saw is the bottom of that is 2 meters because the water is 2 meters below the level of the harbor at low tide. So the slower you go, the farther you go. The top 2 courses here are tracks across the English Channel of the world record holder for the fastest time at 6 hours and 55 minutes and the slowest time, Jackie Corbel, at about 28 hours. And you can see the zigzags back and forth are a lot longer for Jackie. The fastest time, the distance across was about 24 miles, and the slowest one was about 65 miles, so it adds a lot to the distance. And both of those records, interestingly, were broken this last year. They've held for about a decade. The gentleman who broke the fastest record was an Olympic marathon swimmer. He took 8th in the London Olympics, and they say there is one day, perfect day a year for crossing the English Channel, where the weather and the seas are calm, and that's the day he got. And so it was just perfect conditions going across, and he broke the record by 10 minutes. Now, the slowest record would seem like a bad thing, but actually that's quite a feat as well, and that's because of the third factor, and that is the temperature. The English Channel during swim season is approximately 60 degrees, give or take 2 degrees, which is pretty cold. And you can see from the temperature chart at the top, kind of late June, last week of June is traditionally the start of channel swimming season through the first week in October, because then the temperatures start to drop. The chart on the bottom is a common chart in captain's manuals that talks about what your survivability is in cold water. If you fall in the water and it's less than 40 degrees, you have about 15 to 30 minutes to live before you succumb to hypothermia. As the water temperature increases, that goes up. But for swimming at 70 degrees is pretty comfortable. Most swimmers can go a long time at 70 degrees, but as you start dropping below about 65, that drops exponentially. And each degree, when you get around 60, makes a huge difference. The difference between 60 and 55 is massive for the amount of temperature loss. And that is because the body loses heat 24 times faster in water than in air. If you've ever been out in the winter and it's cold and you've got nice dry clothes on versus if you get wet, you know what that difference feels like, that it's a lot colder when you're wet. And so part of the challenge of swimming the channel is being able to deal with the cold. And I didn't mention there are no wetsuits allowed. So the rules of marathon swimming, you cannot have any thermal protection. For men, your suit cannot go onto your legs, so it's essentially a Speedo. For women, it cannot go onto your arms as well. And it has to be out of just a textile material. You can't wear a wetsuit type material for thermal protection at all. If you look at the successful crossings of the channel, 60% of them are in August. If you go a month in either direction, it drops to about 20%. And when you get into June and October, the percentage of the total swims that have been successful is less than 1%. And my date was in October, so I was definitely worried about fighting the cold for that. And it got pushed back later. I ended up swimming in mid-October when it tends to be cold. Fortunately, I had a warm year that it wasn't so bad. This is a picture of my son and I in April at Dover Harbor, and we went for a swim, and we were not the only ones swimming. It was 47 degrees, and there were 2 older women there that swim for 30 minutes every day of the year. We went swimming twice on that trip. The other trip, there was a family out in the water. We were never out where there was not someone else in the water. So it is amazing their tolerance for cold compared to ours here. This gentleman, Gulagar Friberson, is a national hero in Iceland. In 1984, he was on a ship with 5 guys total, fishing off the coast of Iceland, and their net snagged something on the bottom and caused the boat to suddenly flip over. And they found themselves 3.5 miles from shore in 41-degree water. 2 of the men died almost instantly from shock with hitting the water, and the other 3, within minutes, decided to swim toward shore where there was a lighthouse. One within minutes disappeared. The captain lasted about 30 minutes. Gulagarg swam for 3 hours to the lighthouse, and when he got there, there were sheer cliffs where he couldn't get out. He had to swim another half a mile along the shore to find a volcanic rocky beach that he could climb out. He walked a mile to the nearest house, and when he got there, he knocked on the door and he turned around and he saw a trail of red in the snow that was blood from his feet that were all cut up that he didn't even realize because he was so numb. Iceland is a fishing community, and many people have been lost to the sea, and Gulagar is a national hero there because he's the one that came back. And each day and each year in Iceland on March 11, the Icelanders go swimming to celebrate that. Iceland actually has the highest per capita number of swimming pools in the world. Most of them are thermally heated, and there are people, it's a big deal in Iceland to go swimming and hang out at the pool. So Gulagarg was studied when his story got out, and what they found, what helped him to survive, is cold adaptation traits that he had developed. His body is covered with about 4 to 10 millimeters of dense fat that's evenly distributed over his body. His skin is more like that of a seal than of a normal person. And people can generate this on their own. Lynn Cox is another famous open water swimmer. She swam the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia in 38-degree water in the 1980s. And Lynn has about 35% body fat, whereas the average American woman is about 22 to 25%. And it's evenly distributed amongst her body. And much of that fat has been converted to either brown fat or light brown fat. So for most of us who are not cold adapted, your fat is kind of a whitish, yellowish color. But if you adapt to cold, what happens is you build up mitochondria in that fat that generates heat. When we're born as babies, we have pockets of brown fat in our thorax, around our heart, and around our neck. And in Western societies, we lose that fat over time as we get older. Babies need it because they have a high surface area relative to their mass, so they lose heat quickly, and it allows them to stay warm. But here in Western society, we live in air condition and heat, and so we lose that over time. But you can regenerate it by exposure to the cold, and that is part of training for long-distance cold water marathon swimming, is to build up cold adaptation. When Lynn Cox swims, her body temperature rises to about 101 before she gets in the water in anticipation of getting in, and her core temperature is actually higher than her normal level through the whole time she swims. The picture on the bottom is Lynn Cox getting ready to jump in the water in Antarctica to complete her one swim on every continent. She swam a mile in 28-degree water in Antarctica. So the typical open water swimmer is not the typical body type you think of when you think of swimmers. You think of an Olympic swimmer. You have Katie Ledecky and Michael Phelps in the picture here, and they're usually tall and thin. Those swimmers have problems with open water swimming like the English Channel because they get cold. And so for open water swimming, it's probably most commonly triathletes that will try open water swims, and they usually try to gain about 30 pounds before the swim to have more thermal insulation for the event. And then so we talked about distance, currents, temperature, and then the unpredictables, which are the big one being weather, aquatic life, jellyfish, sharks, other things that can eat you. Navigation issues with the boat, medical issues, nausea being a big one, problems with the boat, and there are other things that can develop that oftentimes can be hard to predict or train for. So I'll talk very little about the English Channel, and then I'm going to move on to a couple other swims. So in October 2022, we set off for England with our team, and it takes the whole team to do this. My friends, the Brinks, my wife's right next to me. The Brinks are on either side of us. Paul was a pacing swimmer for me. Next to him, the older gentleman is Mike Daly, who's my coach. And then my friends, the Van Dykes, who went with us on the trip as well. We got to England, and we were able to make it successfully across the channel. You can see my path there. The path was 37 miles long. I was able to finish in 12 hours and 19 minutes, which I was very happy with. We waded through my whole swim window and did not have weather that was cooperative, and so we had planned for that. So I actually ended up swimming at the peak of the spring tide, which is the not ideal time to go. And probably about a third of the way across, I started having problems with nausea and spent about 2 hours throwing up while swimming, which does not help you with your nutrition plan. And then another 2 hours feeling miserable, and my crew was able to get me through. Paul helped pace, keep me going. They changed my feedings on the boat to help get rid of the nausea, and we were ultimately able to make it across. So then what? You swam across the English Channel, that was my goal, and I've talked to this group more about that before, but it was kind of like, okay, what next? I've done all this training, why not do something else? And there are a bunch of swims around the world. What's called the Triple Crown of open water swimming is the English Channel, the Catalina Channel, and 20 Bridges in New York. The 20 Bridges swim is around the island of Manhattan. It's about 29 miles. And so I picked that as the next swim, which I did last year, which we'll talk about in a minute. And there are many other swims around the world. Probably the other major one is the Ocean's 7, which is in that top picture, which is 7 swims all around the world. They're some of the most difficult swims out there, the North Channel probably being the most difficult. And then I thought, well, I could do that, but what about right here in our backyard? We've got the Great Lakes. There are only 4 people that have ever successfully swam all 5 Great Lakes. And one of those is not recognized by the Marathon Swimming Federation. Jim Dreyer, who's probably the best known one here locally, from Michigan, just from Byron Center, swam all 5, but he used a wetsuit for all 5, so they don't count those. So the other 4, which I had not known anything about before, were Vicki Keith, who swam all 5 lakes in 2 months in 1988, which is still an amazing feat. Paula Stevenson, and then most recently Elizabeth Fry, at 60 years old, swam all 5 Great Lakes over a few years and just finished in 2022. So the other thing I thought of with this is when swimming the English Channel, a lot of people do fundraising for it. And for me, kind of going across the English Channel was more of a personal goal. I didn't really get into the fundraising thing, but I thought if I'm going to keep doing this, we should do something bigger with this, something fundraising-wise. And so I did a little research. I thought swim lessons for kids seemed like a good cause for it. And I hadn't known a lot of the statistics, but the number 1 cause of death for children 1 to 4 in the United States is drowning. And it's the number 2 cause, secondary to car accidents, from kids from 5 to 15. A single session of swim lessons between the age of 1 and 4 reduces that risk by 88%, so it makes a huge difference. And right here next to us, Lake Michigan is the deadliest of the Great Lakes. There are 75 to 100 people that drown there every year. And I'm sure all of you know of stories of over the last few years of people that have drowned right at Howland State Park. And so my thought was if we can drown-proof kids, we can help to prevent that. And so I partnered with the Aquatic Center to try to get some people there to help me with the fundraising part, to try to raise awareness for water safety and then make swim lessons more accessible to kids. And there's a whole team there that's helping. Donna Lowry in the top is kind of spearheading it. We've got Tom Seif, who swims with me, Jack, who runs the program there. John Luke at the top there is one of the diving instructors that helped us a lot. And then Elizabeth Box is also on the foundation. Her husband's the mayor. So we decided let's do Lake Michigan first and started out planning our trip. So the plan was in August, when the water is the warmest, to try to make our way across Lake Michigan. And I chose to swim across, kind of wanted to go across the middle of the lake and do the same course that Jim Dreyer had done, Raleigh Point, Wisconsin, to Ludington, Michigan, which the narrowest, so swims are measured by the narrowest distance across. If you swam 100 miles to get there, you get credit for the narrowest distance across, which is 51 miles for this swim. And this would be the first recognized crossing between Wisconsin and Michigan. And it would actually be, there are only 20 swims in recorded history longer than this. So it's a big swim. Of the 25 swims ever over 50 miles, 6 of them have actually been done on the Great Lakes. when I started researching the swim, I don't think I have a pointer on this. Oops, I'm going backwards. I don't have a pointer on here, but on the bottom, so most of the crossings, kind of the recognized crossing of Lake Michigan is actually from Chicago to Michigan City, Indiana, which Chicago you can see on the map, and Michigan City is on the very bottom edge of the lake there. It's just kind of skimming the bottom edge of the lake. And when I looked at that, I felt like, that doesn't seem like you're crossing the lake. There's been a couple that are longer. Not Paula Stevenson, Vicki Keith did to Union Pier, which is a bit longer. And two swimmers, Ted Erickson and Abdel Latif Abdou Haif, swam to Benton Harbor. That's 60 miles, and that was the longest swim in the world for decades after they did it in the 50s. When I look at the list of people that have crossed Lake Michigan, it is daunting once you start looking at the history. Ted Erickson was the first to do it. He's also the first to do a double crossing of the English Channel. Abdul Latif Abdou Haif was ranked the swimmer of the century for the first century of open water swimming. He's an Egyptian swimmer. John Erickson is Ted's son. He was the first to do a triple crossing of the English Channel. Vicki Keith, as I mentioned, swam all 5 Great Lakes in 2 months, including swimming Lake Ontario, all butterfly. In the following year, she swam both the English and the Catalina channels, all butterfly. Jim Dreyer, you know of well here, he's swam all 5 Great Lakes. So did Paula Stevenson and Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth has also done the Ocean 7 and completed the Triple Crown. Dennis Matich is one of the top swimmers in the world in the 1950s, and Greta Anderson was an Olympic gold medalist. So my name doesn't really belong in this group. These are very accomplished swimmers. This was a lofty goal. So we decided to set out, and unlike many of the other swims I've done, there's not any group that takes people across Lake Michigan. So you have to figure out everything yourself, including a boat and all the details that go along with that. And I learned very quickly there's a lot that goes along with the boat and getting things ready. So we try to make a little logo for each of our swims. I think some of you got stickers for our Lake Michigan swim, and the crew gets t-shirts, getting food on the boat, getting things set up with the boat. Fortunately, I had a boat that was capable of doing this, but with even running one engine, it goes faster than I swim. I swim at about 2 miles an hour, so we had to figure out how do we slow the boat down and keep it in a straight line with one engine running. We came up with a system of drag chutes to slow the boat down. We needed a kayak to help stay with me. We had a dinghy for a rescue thing. You have to deal with weather. Mechanical issues on the boat, navigation. It's not just we had due east because you can drift north and south. So there's a lot involved with figuring out the navigation. We needed captains for the boat. The swim was expected to take well over 24 hours. So you need multiple captains to captain in shifts. And then setting up things on the boat, we put markers on the boat that marked us as a vessel of limited mobility, so we have the right of way. And then lights for at night. There's actually a camera hanging off the front of the boat so the captains can see me next to the boat so they don't run me over. And just a lot of work involved with that. And then safety issues. So on the boat, we took safety pretty seriously, and we had a whole medical team along with lots of other safety things in place. We had Dr. John Kramer, who's an emergency physician trained in kind of emergency disaster situations. My sister, Kathy Everts, who's a CRNA, so she's trained in intubation and resuscitation. Ralph Fairbanks was our navigator, and he's involved with the Coast Guard, so we had some connection there. We had medical supplies on the boat, an entire crash cart, so we had a defibrillator, oxygen, intubation supplies, resuscitation medications. We could run a whole code on the boat. The only thing we couldn't do that you could do in the ER was draw labs. So we were prepared for any kind of disaster, not just for me, but for other people on the boat. Antiemetics, because it's very common on the boat, people will get sick, and I don't really want to swim through that. We had 3 captains and a safety plan piled with the Coast Guard. We had both a dinghy and a kayak with lights to help stay with me. And then we always have 2 observers that are observing for taking records to keep our swim legit and official, but also there's always 2 people watching me in the water so that if something happens, someone's always ready to jump in. Of the 9 people who have died in English Channel crossings over 150 years, 3 of them were lost. The swimmer just disappeared, and they found him when their body washed up on shore in another country. Of the 7 that crossed Lake Michigan, 2 swimmers were lost for over a half an hour. Ted Erickson, they were in 5-foot waves and they lost track of them and completely panicked when they could not find him for over 30 minutes. When Jim Dreyer crossed, they had a searchlight out that he was supposed to stay in the light, and he actually fell asleep while swimming and swam off course into the darkness, and they could not find him. And they were afraid to just drive around looking for him because you'd run him over. So they shut off all the engines and sounded the horns and waited for some kind of noise to come back and ultimately found him. So it's a serious thing keeping track of the swimmer, because if something happens, I lose consciousness, you sink very quickly. I don't actually float very well. And then our nutrition plan. After the issues I had with the English Channel with throwing up, we had a nutrition plan and a backup nutrition plan and a backup to that. So we had a weather window of the first 3 weekends in August was when we decided we would try to go. And the first weekend, the weather did not look good. And as we got closer to the second weekend, the third didn't look very good either. The second weekend, it was supposed to storm, but actually it was supposed to have one storm, be clear, and then another storm following, and we thought we could get through in the period in between. So on August 10th, we sent the captains up to Ludington with the boat. The original plan was to send them across to Manitowoc, which was where we'd start from, and then we'd all take the Badger car ferry across. But as many of you may remember, the back of the Badger car ferry fell off last summer, and it was out of commission. So now we needed a way to get to Wisconsin, and our boat was the way. So the captains took the boat up in some heavier seas up to Ludington, and then we met them early the next morning. And the weather forecast for the next day, the first map is 4 a.m. on the 11th with fairly calm seas. The second map is 4 p.m. That lighter blue color in the peak there is about 4-foot plus waves. So the goal was to beat the storm.
Let's go swimming! Whoa!
Woo!
So we're ready to go.
Woo! What you doing? Woo!
Go swimming!
So the next day, the city of Holland was nice enough to send us out with a bang. As the captains went to leave to go, they left early in the morning, and a couple hours later, the city did this. Should happen any second here.
That's true. Oh my goodness.
Here we go.
Wow.
So that was a nice send-off. So the next morning at about 6 a.m. in the dark, we all got up there, loaded our stuff on the boat, and just before we took off, someone took this picture. The first one in line is myself and my wife next to me, Dr. John Kramer next to her, my coach Mike Daly, Bill Blair, who is one of our pacing swimmers, Ed Skierbeek was one of our captains, my sister Kathy, who was our CRNA, Ralph Fairbanks and John Van Dyke, who were also our captains, Josh Nelson, who was a kayaker and a swimmer for me, and then Tom Seif, who helped do video, kayak, and swim. So we had a whole crew, 12 people to get across, and I think it would have been difficult to do it with less, actually. So they say red sky or orange sky in the morning, sailor take warning. We knew what was coming, and the thing in our family is always we're going to beat the storm. So we got a nice start out, and then we never beat the storm, ever. So the seas started getting rougher and then rougher. It's hard to get to picture it in even a video or a picture, but we ended up in about 5-foot waves, and as the lightning was starting, we saw the Manitowoc lighthouse, and we're very relieved to pull in. We had a heck of a time docking the boat in about 45-mile-an-hour winds, but we got her done. And the weather prediction, so the first one here is at about midnight, and you can see the seas are still quite rough. By noon the next day, you can see along the Wisconsin coast, it actually is flattened out, but the Michigan coast is still pretty rough. And the idea was we're going to just follow the waves right across, and then following this, there's another storm coming and it's going to pick up. So we had a window about a day and a half to 2 to make it across. So we spent the day in Manitowoc. They have a World War II submarine we toured. My parents actually happened to be there for something else, and so they took us out to dinner. That night there was a big storm. The guys sleeping in the boat were woken up by the tornado sirens. But by morning, it flattened out nicely. These were the conditions we had at Raleigh Point. So this is me heading into the shore, and the water temperature is supposed to be 72 for the swim.
Oh, that ain't no 72. Welcome to Wisconsin. Yeah.
So Lake Michigan is kind of a conveyor that on this side of the lake, the prevailing winds tend to push the water towards us and it warms on the surface. And so we enjoy the nice warm water unless the winds reverse, and then suddenly it gets very cold very fast. Wisconsin's on the other side of that, and so I expected it was going to be cold for the start, and it was about 57 was the water temperature at Raleigh Point. So we started off swimming from Raleigh Point, and this is where I always think of Bruno Tahana. Bruno Tahana has the distinction of being the shortest ever official attempt at the English Channel in 1952. After training, paying his deposit, and his boat captain, he swam 100 yards and said, "I'm done." And it always seems like a great idea when you're planning this, like swimming the English Channel, that seems awesome. I'm looking across the English Channel, I can do that, this is great. And then when you're sitting on the dinghy and it's 47 degrees out and the water is 62, and you have 18 hours of being stung by jellyfish and swimming potentially ahead of you, it seems like a really bad idea all of a sudden. But we kept swimming, swam through the day, and I had different people get in and pace and kayak as we went through. So in the rules of marathon swimming, you can have a pacer after the first hour. They can swim with you for an hour, and then they have to be out for an hour, and then they can come back in. You can't draft off them. They have to stay behind or next to you. So the first pacer was Bill Blair. I always tease because he's Scottish, and the Scottish are known for cold water. Most of the Scottish locks are in the mid-50s, and Bill does not like the cold. And it was 59 when he got in, and he was very hesitant about getting in. But as we swam probably 15 minutes into his swim, the water went from 59 to 72, just like that. Within one body length, it was like there was a line in the water, and you could just suddenly feel this massive change in temperature. And then it stayed in the low 70s the rest of the way across. So we kept swimming on through the day, different pacers and kayakers. As we're going, I'm getting tired. My shoulder was starting to bother me, but I felt like we were making good progress. The wind seemed to change. I was hoping we'd have a push going across, and it seemed to change where it felt like I was swimming against some waves for a little bit, but nothing terrible. And we were making good progress. A nice straight course on this. If you zoom in a little closer, we're not quite so straight, but we were making a good straight course across. And then it started to get evening. I'm swimming as it's starting to get dark. If you look close, there's a light on the back of my head. And this is one of the last pacers before night as we're getting ready to go into the dark. And I'm thinking now, at this point I've been swimming for about 12 hours. And you're tired, you just want to get out and be done. But I'm also thinking, this is going pretty well. I felt like the swim was going all right. Felt very confident we were going to make it through the night. And with these kind of swims, it's not about thinking about getting to the end. A lot of times it's more about what we call segmentation. I do a feeding about every 30 minutes. And at some point you get where you just want to be done. And it's like, well, I can make it one more feeding. So I'll go one more feeding and then maybe I'll quit then. And you get to the next feeding and it's the same thing and you just keep going. And at this point I was still feeling pretty good. I'm like, I'm very confident I can get through till morning and then we'll kind of evaluate then. So night fell, we kept swimming, and during this time, the boat initially was able to stay right next to me very nicely. But as we went, the boat kept having more and more problems staying with me, and it felt like it was a wind issue where the boat was just being pushed off. But when we'd stop for a feeding, the boat would get way off course. They'd send me ahead with a kayaker, and the boat would be off in the distance, and then eventually they'd come back around and catch up with us. As it got to be dark, this kept getting worse, and this is kind of the big issue for safety, is especially at night. I don't want to be out with a kayaker and we completely lose the boat out here, so it's starting to get to be a concern. And then in the dark, after about 13 hours of swimming, my sister was in the kayak and we got a call that we got a problem, you need to come back to the boat. And I looked back and the boat seemed like it was about 500 yards, about a quarter mile behind me. And I'm like, I'm not swimming backwards. What are you talking about? Like, no, we got a problem. You got to come back. And so things had kind of added up. I was getting concerned a little bit about our safety plan with where we were. And I was hoping we had covered half or more of the distance across the lake. So we got back to the boat and found out what the problem was. We had no steering. You could just take the wheel and spin it around. The rudder did nothing. And what we quickly determined is the reason we were having trouble keeping the boat straight for the last several hours is we've been slowly losing steering. They opened the engine compartment. There's hydraulic fluid everywhere. We blew a hydraulic line. And it looked like the swim was over. And then I had brought tools to do a repair, but didn't know if anyone would be able to fix the boat. And fortunately, Josh Nelson's a pretty good mechanic, and he went down and started fixing it. He's like, I think I can fix it. And then about 10 minutes later, it's like, nope, I think we're done. Wait, I think I can fix it. And this went on for about 45 minutes. And as I'm sitting there treading water, because I'm not allowed to touch the boat during the swim or anyone else, I'm starting to get cold. And then I ask the question that you never tell the swimmer, and that is how far you are. The swimmer, you never tell them how far they've gone in the swim. And I was thinking we were at 20 to 30 miles at least across. And they said, yeah, we've been at about 13 miles in 13 hours. You've been swimming in place for about 6 hours with a strong current against you. And so now things were starting to add up where we're not making progress. We got a strong current. I'm getting cold. I'm definitely tired. And we're putting the safety of everyone on the boat in jeopardy now because we are dead in the water with no steering. In the 45 minutes we were stopped, we drifted 2 miles straight north from the currents. So we were in a good 2 mile an hour or more current. So that's when I decided, I think we're done. Like, we need to get the boat fixed, get everybody back safely. We're going to end this swim. So we went back to, Josh was able to get the boat fixed. He stole hose clamps from a double clamped fuel line, sealed up the line, filled the system with water to maintain hydraulic pressure, and we got the boat back to the fuel dock in Ludington. All the hotels were booked in Ludington, so at about 2 in the morning, everybody took off driving home, except for me, because I couldn't sit up in the boat. I had fallen asleep for most of the trip home, and every time I sat up, I got lightheaded because I was hypovolemic, so they gave me a bag of IV fluid, and we were good to go. Went home, slept for the night, got up the next day, bought some supplies, and went back, and we repaired the boat and brought it back home. And we got home, the Holland Aquatic Center had a banner on my deck saying we'd raised over $20,000 for swim programs for the kids, which we were happy with. Well, thank all of you. I'm sure some of you donated. So afterwards, we had a meeting of kind of what did we learn from this? And we learned a lot of things. Number one, it'd be good to have 2 boats. We had some trouble with the kayak flipping, so some things we could do better with that. My shoulder problems really were due to part of the stroke of my swimming, so we've been working on that all winter to get that better. And the main thing we learned is a long way across. It's no joke. And the currents were much more formidable than what I had expected. The temperature was an issue when we stopped, but all in all, I felt like we had a good swim, we had a good team, we had a good plan, we learned some things. One of the main things we learned, and I don't know how well you can see it here, those arrows aren't very clear, but the area where we swam across is that kind of darkish red area in the middle. The darker the color, the stronger the currents. When we started, the currents were kind of going about straight south, so we didn't get a lot of assistance, but it didn't really hurt us much. We were able to make good progress, and then the currents switch and go straight against us for the next several hours. and that's when I was swimming in place for about 6 hours. About the time we were having the mechanical problems, the current switched to the north. They're just going around like a clock. And we drifted 2 miles north in about 45 minutes. And then had we kept swimming, they actually changed to go with us for several hours. So had we swam another 4 or 5 hours, we probably would have more than doubled our distance with the currents with us. But then if you keep watching, it does the exact same thing. It went around like a clock a second time, so we would have run into that same barrier again. And I figure it would have taken us probably close to the 30 to 36 hour range to make it across if we'd not had the boat problems. So was it a failure? When I got done, I actually felt like we had a great swim. It's the longest I'd ever swam. English Channel was 12 hours and 19 minutes, so I'd gone over 13 hours. Felt like the swim was good, that things were going well with the swim, and felt like I could swim longer yet. But I had understood at the beginning that this was a huge bite to try to take off, that this was more than double the length of the English Channel. And beginning of the summer, my expectations were fairly low, actually, about being able to make it across, and that kind of built as the summer went on. By the time we started, I felt pretty good about it. One of the favorite quotes I have heard is from the coach who coaches Katie Ledecky, who's one of the greatest female swimmers in history. And her coach will tell you that she fails more than anybody that he's ever met. And that's because she sets ridiculous goals for herself. Her training pace for practice is world record pace. And she's trying to hit that and better her times. And when she broke the world record, it wasn't to keep the world record. She wanted to swim seconds faster than that. Setting those goals high, and I knew this one was a high goal. And I didn't feel like when we stopped, like we quit. It's really more of mitigating risks. And at some point, the risks start to outweigh the benefits. And you can keep swimming, but for diminishing gains and much increasing risks. So I don't regret that we stopped when we did, because there's certainly no guarantee that if we kept going, that boat would have made it to shore over another 24 hours of swimming. So then what? Well, back to training. I got another swim to do. So this is the group I train with, and don't these guys look fun? They're a great group to swim with. This is the Big Shoulders race in Chicago, and then off to New York. On September 28th, I was scheduled to swim the 20 Bridges swim around Manhattan Island, which would be my second of the Triple Crown to try to achieve. It's a 29-mile swim, so it's the longest of Triple Crown races. But the advantage of 20 Bridges and what makes it a fun swim is the currents, the tides are timed with you. And so the current pushes you for 20 Bridges. So even though it's the longest swim, it's typically by far the fastest. The trick with 20 Bridges is you have to make the transition points before the tide switches. If you don't, you are finished. The current in the East River is about 6 miles an hour, and as I said, an Olympic swimmer swims at about 3. So when that tide reverses, you're done. Most people start right at the tip of New York at the Battery and work their way up the East River, and you have to reach the Harlem River before the tide switches and the East River reverses direction. The Harlem River is fairly calm and slow. You can actually swim against the current in the Harlem River. Work your way out to the Hudson, and then the Hudson always flows down, and make your way back down the Hudson with the current with you. My race actually was a little different in that I started at Mill Rock, which is right where the East River and the Harlem River meet, and it's a little bit actually faster place to start from. So we stayed right next to the World Trade Center. The boat dock was within walking distance from there, and got on the boat the morning of the swim. It used to be a race around Manhattan Island in the 80s and 90s, and they switched it a few years ago, so it's an individual swim, but there's usually 1 to 3 swimmers doing it at the same time. And this is Barry Murphy from Ireland that's swimming with me. He's completed the Irish Triple Crown, which includes the North Sea, so a very accomplished swimmer. And then next to us is my team, my wife Stacy, our boat captain, and Ari, a woman from Japan, who is our kayaker. And this is Mill Rock. It sits in an area called Hellgate, named by the Dutch for the fierce currents for navigation in that area. When the tides switch, the currents are very strong there. And this is me getting ready to get in, and we're off. So it's kind of cool. You've got the New York skyline in the background, and I'm in the distance. Barry's the nearer kayak as we take off and cross the first bridge and enter into the Harlem River and swimming along. And you can see on our tracker map where we were. The second picture over, I'm swimming by Yankee Stadium. Aries giving me my feedings as we're going around New York. As you work your way farther down, it actually gets kind of more wooded. It actually seems kind of rural in that part of Manhattan. And this is High Bridge. It looks like an aqueduct because it used to be. That's where the water for New York City used to come into the city. And then you reach the last bridge in the Harlem as it transitions into the Hudson River. And this bridge is so low, the accompanying boats can't get under it. You can swim under it, but they had to open the bridge for us. We went around, we had a whole armada. There was a boat each, so Barry and I had a kayak and a support boat. There was a third backup support boat, and we had a New York Police Department boat escort the entire way around Manhattan. I think they didn't trust us. The current in the Hudson River is very strong, so you can see from that buoy, which is not moving, how quick the current is that's pushing you down, and so it's great. It's just like you're flying down the river. There's only one bridge over the Hudson, and that's the George Washington Bridge. The Hudson is much wider than the other rivers. So there's also what's called the 8 Bridges swim, which sounds like it should be shorter, but it's about 150 miles from Albany to New York City, and there are 8 bridges that cross the Hudson. There's a little lighthouse. There was a children's book written about it, about the Little Red Lighthouse, and there it is. As you come farther into New York, the skyline changes, which is nice because you can kind of see where you're at. It starts out kind of wooded, then you get these kind of masonry buildings, and then the glass buildings of downtown Manhattan. And it's busy. There are helicopters, there are boats, there are cruise ships. This is about where the miracle on the Hudson happened that I'm swimming over right now, and I'm kind of surprised there was a clearing big enough for them to get through. And then there's where we started from, the marina next to the World Trade Center building. When we got to the tip of the Battery, we had to stop because the Statue of Liberty ferry was coming out. And I was about 10 to 15 minutes ahead of Barry in our swim. And so we had to wait for the ferry at about 4 or 5 minutes. And then the police escort told us, you got to wait now for the Staten Island ferry. So I waited in treaded water for 20 minutes. Barry caught up to us. I got a nice picture with the Statue of Liberty in the background. And then we were off again to the Brooklyn Bridge, which is my favorite of the bridges. And Barry took kind of his kayaker took a shorter course around that I didn't realize, but he got ahead of me. He ended up finishing a couple minutes before me because of our wait. And then we worked our way to the Queensboro Bridge on Roosevelt Island. And by now the current is with me and moving fairly quickly. If you look close, there's some walkers in the background that I'm swimming right on by. I'm probably doing about 6 to 7 miles an hour with the current at this point. And then up ahead is Rock Island and the finish. And the ride back, the Brooklyn Bridge, I finished in 7 hours and 37 minutes, which I was very happy with. Usually most finishes are around 9 hours for the 20 bridges swim. And then the aftermath. So everybody asked me, how clean is the water in New York? And I was assured it was very clean. It is not very clean. They have a combined sewer system in New York. And taking antibiotics is a wise idea. At the end of my swim, it started raining, and it continued to rain very heavily. There were actually swimmers the next day. They had massive flooding in New York. They had 9 inches of rain overnight. LaGuardia Airport flooded. And this is a thing off from TikTok.
Don't make unnecessary journeys. Don't take risks on treacherous roads. And don't swim in the sea. Incredibly, people have been spotted in the water here in Blackrock and Salt Hill, both today
and yesterday. And yesterday was me. So one of the inspirations for me with the Great Lakes and with the fundraising was a lady named Vicki Keith. And Vicki Keith, as I mentioned earlier, in 1988 swam all 5 Great Lakes in 2 months' time, including Lake Ontario, all butterfly. She later did a double crossing of Lake Ontario, all butterfly. And part of it was to raise money, and she raised $1.2 million in her swims to support a camp for disabled kids in Canada, where she helps run the swimming program there. And one of the swimmers she coached is a young girl named Ashley Cowan, who is a quadruple amputee. At 18 months old, she developed meningitis that went to sepsis, and they had to take all 4 limbs to save her life. At about 8 years old, she showed up at Vicki Keith's pool and said, "I want to swim lakes like you." And so Vicki said, "Well, I guess nothing's impossible," and put her in the water and had her swim, and she got about halfway across the pool in a fury of activity and was completely exhausted. And so she sent her off with one of the other coaches to learn to swim better, and a couple months later, she came back and she said, "What do I have to do to be in your group?" And she said, well, apparently they had talked about it. She said, "You need to swim 8 lengths of the pool with flip turns, and then we'll talk about it." So Ashley went over, plopped in the water, swam 8 lengths with flip turns, got out, and said, "Am I in your group now?" And she swam with her, and over the next few years, she trained her. She went to nationals in Canada, and she missed the Special Olympics at 15 years old by 0.2 seconds. And in a disappointment afterwards, Vicki Keith walked up to her and said, "You remember why you came to see me in the first place?" And she said, "Yes, I do. I remember I wanted to swim lakes like you." And Vicki said, "I think you're ready." And so Vicki took her out to Lake Erie, and this is a picture of their start, and you can see all the people. There was nobody. It was just Vicki, or I think her mom, and Ashley, as she got into the water, and no one showed up to see her swim because nobody thought she could do it. About halfway across the lake, all of a sudden people realized, holy cow, like this girl might make it across. It's a 12-mile crossing across Lake Erie on the southern route. And that's when the helicopters started showing up with news media to film her. By the time she landed on the other side, there were hundreds of people on shore. The story went national news in Canada, and the next day it went national news on CNN in the US, and within 3 days it was the top story all over the world. And what Vicki Keith will tell you is that don't focus on what seems impossible, set your goals high. And if you don't make them, you probably still get a lot farther than you would have. If a quadruple amputee can swim across Lake Erie, I think anyone can. And one of Vicki Keith's goals was the fundraising part of things, and that's part of my goal with doing these other swims. I mean, the swims themselves are great, and I look forward to doing them, but the big part of it is the fundraising. And my goal is to try to do what Vicki Keith did and raise $1 million to pay for swim lessons here at the Aquatic Center. And I don't know if that'll be possible or not, but that's our goal. And so for anyone who'd like to donate, there's a QR code. If you got stickers, it's on there as well. But last year we raised $50,000 for swim lessons. They started putting that money to work this winter and hired 2 instructors, and over the last few months have given 130 swim lessons for kids who could not afford it otherwise. And we've got hundreds of donations from private folks. Hayworth is just our first corporate sponsor, and we're hoping to have more of those in the next few years. I'd like to thank my coach, Mike Daly, all the guys I swim with for helping to push me along, the teams that have gone with me to England and Lake Michigan, my family who's spent many days in a cold kayak on Lake Makatawa, and then all the folks that have helped me with fundraising at the Aquatic Center, and you. Thank you very much.
We have some time for Q&A.
I'm just curious how you swim differently in freshwater and saltwater. The buoyancy factor has to be a great challenge to you.
Yeah, saltwater is definitely more buoyant. and that is helpful for the swims, but it also is fairly caustic, and I tend to end up drinking a lot of water when I'm swimming, even though I don't try to. So I end up ingesting a lot of salt, and that was, for me, I think a big part of my problem in the English Channel when I got really sick, nauseous, was all the extra salt coming in. So that's usually the biggest challenge. And then the other challenge is there's more aquatic life usually in salt water. None of the Great Lakes have things that'll bite you or sting you. But I fortunately have still not been stung by a jellyfish, or at least not any bad sting that I realized. But most people do get jellyfish stings with those. So that's the other challenge of salt water.
Thank you, Bryan. That was just fantastic.
Thanks, John.
And congratulations. And keep up the good work. Two things. Do you carry a GPS tracker with you, like an EPIRB or something equivalent to that? Or
Yes, we have it's called a spot tracker. We use for the Lake Michigan swim. That's a satellite tracking unit. And for most of the organized swims that have groups that take people across, they have some kind of a tracker device as well. We also were a little concerned about like losing me or the kayaks, so we actually took air tags, the Apple things, and I had one of those in my swim cap so that if I wandered off, they could maybe find me. I don't know how effective they'll be, but the GPS is quite helpful.
also, do you keep track of your level of hypothermia? Is there any way to monitor that and know when you're getting critical, or what do you do to mitigate falling into a zone that's going to be trouble?
So they actually make a device called body caps where you wear a wristwatch device and you swallow a pill. So most temperature devices that you can buy for athletics measure your skin temperature, which doesn't work in the water because I'm completely submerged in 60-degree water, so it's going to just read 60 the whole time. But with this device, it's actually reading your core temperature because you swallow this pill. I'll usually swallow one the night before, and then I swallow one again right before the event in case I throw one up, that the other one's a little farther downstream. But that will then can be used on a tablet device on the boat to see what my real-time core body temperature is. Where it was most helpful for me is for qualifying for the English Channel. You have to do a 6-hour swim in under 60-degree water. And by the time it worked out for me to do that, there was no water around here cold enough. My kid goes to school at Michigan Tech, so we dropped him off at school and swam in Eagle Harbor, which is just below Copper Harbor up on the Keweenaw Peninsula. And Lake Erie, or Lake Superior was about 51, but I found about 58-degree water. Swam there a couple days, and then the morning I showed up to do my 6-hour swim, the wind changed and the water dropped to 53. And that is the coldest I have ever been, 6 hours in that water, and I probably would have gotten out had it not been for the temperature monitoring system that I could actually see what my core temperature was. So you start looking for other physical signs of hypothermia, your lips turning blue. If you get cold enough, you start getting contractures in your hand. And I was getting those contractures, which I was fairly concerned about, but my body temperature, my core temperature never dropped below 98 during the swim. The most dangerous time is actually about 20 minutes after you get out of the water. And it's because the body's compensatory mechanism for cold is it constricts the blood vessels to your appendages, your arms and your legs. And so it allows them to get colder by keeping your core warmer. But as you start to warm up, those vessels open, and I can tell you they open fairly suddenly, because I get it routinely when I'm swimming before work in the morning in Lake Michigan. As I'm driving home, all of a sudden I'll get this very sudden cold rush where those vessels just open up and just dump all that cold blood back into your heart. And so that's when it's a problem, and the key is to not get too cold beforehand. So hypothermia starts at about 95, and the only time I've been that cold actually is when I'm sleeping. My temperature drops to about 95. But in swimming, it's always close to 98. Once you hit 90, that's the lower level of moderate hypothermia, and if you start getting down into the mid-80s, you're going to die. And so the key is to recognize that beforehand, because once you get out of the water, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
I'm assuming that your feedings are liquid. Do you make those yourself, and how many calories and how often?
Yep, so usually I do feedings every 30 to 45 minutes, and you're allowed to warm them, which is nice. So usually we have warm water to mix them. It's a sports energy drink designed for long distance things, so it's actually a complex carbohydrates that don't break down very quickly. And so I'll drink that. And the stuff I have does not taste very good. I don't think that helps with my nausea. And so usually I'll chase it with either like gummy bears, or my New York swim, I actually use little honey packs that I could just tear the top off and I could suck the honey in. The honey actually coats your mouth pretty well, which helps with the salt as well. But they're not actually a ton of calories. When I first started, my thought was you need to replace the calories you're burning on the way across. Well, swimming the English Channel burns about 14 to 20,000 calories. And even if I can eat pretty good, but I can't eat that much. And so that's actually a bad plan, and that's where a lot of people end up with nausea issues, is having too big of feedings. You actually want your feedings to be a much smaller calorie level, a couple hundred calories each feeding.
I'm curious, on the double and triple swims, can you get onto the shore, and for how long?
Yep, there's a time limit. I think it's like around 5 minutes. It might be as long as 10. But yes, when you cross, you can get out of the water, and then by the time that time limit expires, you have to get back in. One of the rules for marathon swimming is you have to clear the water under your own power, so no one can assist you. So you'll see pictures of some of the older swims where there were like crowds of people to meet someone. They're holding everyone back, so nobody helps support them, because you're disqualified if that happens. So you have to enter the water under your own power and exit under your own power. The week I was in England, I talked to a guy who was the observer on another swim. And the girl swam across, and you have to urinate actually while you're swimming, or you'll build up salts in your system. And she lied to her team, and she wasn't peeing like she should be, and she got disoriented. And she swam across the English Channel. She got to the other shore, and she could not recognize that she got to land. She was so confused. She just kept swimming in place against the bottom of the water and could not get out. And her swim did not count.
Bryan, I have a couple questions. The first one is, how do you psych yourself up knowing all the obstacles ahead? And then the second is, could you explain a little bit more about the wetsuit thing? You didn't wear that in Michigan, is that right?
Correct, yep. So they do not, so the rules of Marathon Swimming Federation that certifies these swims do not allow for a wetsuit. You can't have any thermal protection. Depends on the swim. The English Channel, your suit cannot go on your legs. A lot of guys, when I swim, typically I wear what are called jammers that are more like biker shorts. They still aren't neoprene or have any insulation, but you can wear those for some swims. And you can use grease. So you'll see people covered with goose fat for swims. You're allowed to do that. Has some thermal protection, but it is extremely messy. If you touch anything and touch your goggles, you're not going to see for the rest of the swim. So I don't typically use it. I think the one biggest advantage is it helps with jellyfish stings. For psyching myself up, I mean, it's a lot of training to get ready. I'm kind of visualizing success at the end. I try not to think about the swim. And that's the part where when I get in the water to start, like everything seems great because I'm thinking about finishing. And then when you start, all of a sudden I'm thinking about starting and all this swimming that goes. It's ahead of me. There's a gentleman named Kevin Murphy, who's it's called the King of the Channel. He's crossed the English Channel 34 times. And I heard an interview with him one time that said, you must love swimming. Like these events, you must love them. And he says, no, they're miserable. Like when you're swimming across, halfway across, it is miserable. But it's the finishing. That's the great reward, is getting to the other side and the accomplishment of doing it. And that's the part that's worth it.
Do you know if you have increased your brown fat content any?
Yeah, so from that temperature monitoring system, so unfortunately, the temperature monitoring system was not cheap, and I bought it, and it was very helpful for that training swim. I wore it on both the English Channel and Lake Michigan, and it did not work on either one of them. The wristband thing that's supposed to be waterproof filled with water within the first 20 minutes, and I had no data after that. So that was pretty frustrating. I'm on my third one now, which hopefully will work better. But I do have data from the beginning of a few of these swims, and what I find is so I take one of the pills before I go to bed at night, and my lowest temperature is while I'm sleeping. It drops, my body temperature drops to about 95 degrees, so it would actually be considered mildly hypothermic. And when I get up, the temperature comes up. Before my swim, it increases to a little over, close to 101 before I get in the water. And then it will stabilize, usually I'm about 98 during the swim. So I can see that it does do that, and that's from building up brown fat and acclimation. And you can also just feel it. I actually did my first open water swim of the year yesterday in Lake Makatawa, which, believe it or not, is 60. It's actually quite nice. And when I first started swimming and doing open water, when I got into 60-degree water, it was just ridiculously cold. I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to last for, 14, 16, however long it takes me to get across the English Channel. This is not going to be possible. And now I'm quite comfortable swimming in 60-degree water. Your body definitely gets acclimated. Interestingly, you cannot cold acclimate and hot acclimate at the same time. You can do one or the other, but not both. So I don't do well in heat.
I was just wondering, when you go through a body of water like the English Channel, which has so much cross traffic, what do you do to avoid big ships coming at you?
Yeah, Lake Michigan, it wasn't as much of an issue, but for the English Channel is the busiest shipping lane in the world. 20% of the world's shipping goes through the English Channel daily. There are about 600 freighters. There are hundreds of ferries. There are about 2,000 recreational boats. I don't think I have it in my slide deck here, but I have a picture of Lake Michigan, a shipping act where you can see the freighters. And there's about 20 freighters out in Lake Michigan. And then I have one of the same time in England, and there are thousands of freighters. There's just a continuous line. When you are swimming, and I didn't know this till I started doing it, but they mark the vessel as a vessel with limited mobility, and that gives you the right of way of everything except for a boat without a captain, adrift. And so it's used for boats that lay cable, minesweepers, things like that, where they cannot deviate their course. And the English Channel, that's the way they treat the swimming boats. There are harbors at both Dover and Calais. Calais is one of the busiest shipping ports in France, and they're in radio contact with freighters, and they act kind of like aircraft control and tell them you've got a swimmer up ahead and that they have to veer their course. They have to start turning 6 miles before they reach us. And I've got a picture of a tanker that's probably about 200 yards behind me. And our boat captain said he's had a tanker cross within 50 yards behind the boat. So that's not a good time to stop for feeding.
I think we are done.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. It would seem you proved Vince Lombardi correct. I have a few more announcements for you. Those of you who want to volunteer for HASP activities, talk to Beverly Rhino of the Service Committee. Those of you who have not yet had your portrait taken for the online directory, Ralph Fairbanks is here somewhere with his camera. Please get that done. Our next meeting will be our business meeting, June 11th. Come to that one, you'll get fed. There are stickers available for the 2 swims, the 20 Bridges swim and the Great Lakes swim that was provided to us by Bryan. And I think David Blatt has a bag full of those somewhere. David, you're around here. Brian, are you available to sign autographs too? Okay, just
It'll be a first.
count me in. I think I am done. Class is dismissed.